Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Halo Reach for Xbox 360. This is a first-person shooter, the follow-up to Halo 3 ODST, and the prequel to the original Halo Combat Evolved. It was released for Xbox 360 in September of 2010 and was met with a large amount of acclaim, although the fan reaction was very mixed, with a lot of people preferring Halo 3 to this. So I guess the question there becomes, what is polarizing about this? What makes it not really palatable to Halo fans, at least Halo 3 fans, and yet what makes it so palatable to pretty much everybody else? Well, as far as the presentation goes, it's definitely a step up over Halo 3 and Halo 3 ODST, with textures being higher res, animations being smoother and more fluid, more detailed, including things like the addition of separate reload animations depending on whether your magazine is completely empty or only partially empty. Took them frickin' long enough, huh? It's not like this was a fairly standard feature in most FPSs by then, but I digress. The amount of detail they packed into the environments is also better, and everything is made better by the increasing of the FOV. In the single-player campaign, the FOV was increased to 78 as opposed to the 55 of Halo 3 and ODST and 65 of Halo 2. Which is to say, this game doesn't give me nausea. It just gives me a mild headache after considerable time playing. So I can actually play the thing? That blows my mind already. But fun fact, Halo fans complained about this. Yes, they complained that the FOV is an objective improvement. That should tell you what kind of people you're dealing with. Anyway, they also improve the particle effects, and the game in general just looks so much better than Halo 3 and ODST. You would be forgiven for thinking that it came out on another system entirely. But here's the thing. This thing does not hold up well on the Xbox 360 in that if you play this thing, you will notice frame rate drops. Considerable frame rate drops. And it becomes pretty obvious that they were pretty much pushing the Xbox 360 to its limits with this one, or they hadn't quite figured out every single optimization in their engine yet, and it had just messed things up as a result. Ultimately, that doesn't become as much of an issue as you might think, however, so you can kind of put that out of your mind. It would be nice if they managed to optimize it a bit more and keep it a solid 60 frames per second at all times, but it's not a huge enough drop to be considered unplayable or anything like that. It's just momentary drops when there's a lot of stuff happening on screen at once, so it's fairly tolerable. And then there's the sound design, which, as always, is pretty great, apart from the sound effects. Although some of the sound effects are a bit better, not much better than the previous games. They're slightly beefier, but that's kind of it. They brought back some old sound effects from older weapons and such in the previous Halo games, and they also decided to do a different style to the music, where this one is a lot less of the kind of stuff you saw in the previous several Halo games. This soundtrack is actually pretty somber stuff, and it works really well for the game considering its context, which I'll get to in a moment. But the soundtrack itself is once again very well done. Martin O'Donnell and Michael Salvatore. So it's the same guys who did the soundtracks for the previous Halo games, and it works out very, very well in the game's favor. And then there's the voice acting, which is also extremely well done, and actually is a bit better done than the rest of the entire series. They definitely had a very talented cast with this one, including one character who is voiced by an actor who you also might know from The Wire, if you've ever seen that show. So it goes without saying that the actual voice cast itself is definitely one of the best parts of this game's presentation, even though you run into some issues when you get to the actual characters themselves and of course the plot, but that's beside the point. The actual voice talent is very good and the direction is also very well done, so it all blends together to make a very solid presentation overall. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this takes place before the events of the original Halo Combat Evolved, and takes place during what is known as the Fall of Reach. If you're not familiar with any of the Halo lore at all, Reach was one of the biggest human strongholds, if not the biggest human stronghold aside from Earth, and the Covenant glassed it. They just laid waste to the entire planet, completely demolished the resources that the UNSC had there, and thus the human race was crippled militarily for quite some time, and that was where they were really put on the not only defensive but on the very much losing side of the war up until the events of the Halo trilogy. And you play as Spartan B312, who is up to you, really. This Spartan actually can be customized by you, either male or female, as well as what their armor looks like, its colors, its attachments, and things like that. So you can really make this Spartan your own if you want, and that was what they were very much intending to do. Unlike in the previous several Halo games where the character you were playing was basically just a suit of armor that you were supposed to project your personality into, now you actually can sort of do that by customizing the armor and basically saying, well, this is how I want this Spartan to be, and thus this is my Spartan, so to speak. So everyone's B312 is going to look a bit different, and ultimately, it's actually somehow easier to get attached to the character since you have more of that control over them. And even though they have some history that is alluded to, it's never really established, per se. And really, there's not much character there to begin with, so what do you expect, really? This one really is more of a just suit of armor to project your personality into, but again, it works better than Master Chief did, because you can customize the Spartan. You can make up your own backstory to them and everything. At any rate, you are assigned to Noble Team, which is one of the groups of Spartan 3s that are on the planet. And you start off on a mission that has Noble Team going to a communications outpost, and you find out that the Covenant is there, and they are starting their attack on Reach. And from there, it goes on to basically take you through the entire fall of Reach. Now, each member of Noble Team, except for you, of course, has their own sort of backstory, their own characterization. Most of them really aren't all that interesting, honestly, and ultimately, they're kind of just walking suits of armor that occasionally make a quip or something like that, and really they're more defined by their roles within the squad than anything else. One of them is the communications specialist, you've got the heavy weapons guy, you've got the scout sniper, you've got the commander, you've got you, who's just kind of this jack of all trades, things like that. And so, these characters aren't really all that compelling, but they're more interesting than several of the characters in the previous games, so there's that. But there's both a strength and a weakness in the plot in that when you meet these characters, you know they're all dead men. You just know it. And over the course of the game, that does come true. I'm not really spoiling anything for you here. The casualties on Reach were massive. But even then, if you don't know that they're dead men going into the game, it's kind of on you. You're kind of oblivious. They very much foreshadow this. And while that lends this kind of sense of inevitability to the plot, where you know at some point each one of these characters is going to die or just disappear entirely and things like that, or you know that horrible things are going to happen to all these different people that you're running into, well, it also makes it kind of hard to get attached to them. Since you already know that they're all going to die at some point, it's pretty hard to actually get attached to them. And when they go through these heroic deaths, or sometimes not heroic deaths, you end up with some situations that come across as slightly melodramatic, although it's certainly not overly done, and generally it's pretty tasteful how they handle things. And you just constantly get this sense of, well, you're Spartans, you just have to deal with it. You know your guys are going to die at some point. And with Spartan 3s in particular, if you know anything about the backstory, which I don't blame you if you don't, because they do a terrible job of explaining this kind of thing in the games, but if you know anything about the Spartan 3 program, you know they're basically cannon fodder. And so they die by the hundreds. So while the plot ends up being more competent than the previous games, it still isn't a particularly great plot. It's just solid enough to keep you going throughout the game. Unlike in the previous games where the plot was stupid and ridiculous, and you were just going, no game, stop it, you're being ridiculous. Whereas in this one, it feels appropriate. So it works out pretty well in the game's favor, oddly enough. But what about the gameplay? because this is one of the big sticking points I have with the previous Halo games, namely Halo 2 and 3 and ODST. Well, in this particular case, this is the first Halo game since the original that I've felt has actually evolved. Rather than make some very incremental changes, this thing actually changed up a fair amount. It brought back the health system from the original Halo, where you had health packs scattered throughout the world that you needed to replenish your health at, but you had the shields that would recharge over time as well. So it's nice to have that back instead of just your shields are gone, you're going to die now, that the previous two games had, and of course the just general regenerating health that they had in ODST. And they rebalanced a lot of the weapons so that each of them now kind of has a specific role rather than just, well, let's use the battle rifle because there's not really anything better than that except for the sniper rifle and the shotgun. So that's good, although the Covenant weapons are still really underpowered for the most part unless you're using the needle rifle or the fuel rod gun. They lowered the amount of grenades that are available back down to frag grenades and plasma grenades. They removed dual wielding entirely, which is an interesting choice and oddly enough works fine in the game's favor, believe it or not. And they introduced an assassination system where you can hold down the melee button to get a third-person animation of just an insta-kill. And if you just tap the melee button, you do the normal swing. So that's kind of an interesting way of doing things, and the assassinations can be done from behind mostly. And another interesting thing they did just to tweak things was to actually add variable accuracy. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that your crosshair actually moves when you're shooting. So you actually get some indication of just how accurate you are at any given point. And it's actually extremely helpful in keeping you accurate because in the previous games you just had a reticle and you had to hope that your bullets were actually hitting things because you just had a fairly large sized reticle and just, well, there wasn't much precision to that. This time around you actually do have some precision to go off of, so that really does help. That's not to say you get any penalties from firing while on the move like in most other games. In fact, you don't get any penalties. Instead, you get penalties for rapid fire. So it really discourages just opening fire and hoping that all of your bullets go in their general direction, because, well, they're not going to. It instead rewards controlled bursts and controlled fire, which, if this were a PC game, I would be applauding, but it is a console game, and thus I am only ambivalent toward, simply because the lack of precision in the controls is still a problem, and they still do throw some precision-based enemies at you that need to move around quickly and such like that, so that can be pretty problematic at times. And of course they did tweak the arsenal in general with both weapons and vehicles to where old favorites will return, and in the case of weapons you'll get some new ones like the DMR, the Designated Marksman Rifle, and you'll also get some classics returning, again like the old Magnum, or you'll get some things removed, like there's no battle rifle in this game, for example, so the DMR basically takes its spot. And like I said, everything has its own role, so you're going to want something for long range and you're going to want something for close or medium range, so you're going to have some pretty decent options this time around, unlike in the previous Halo games where you were pretty much screwed. Unfortunately, they didn't tweak the enemy AI or anything like that, at least it didn't seem like they did, so they're still a bit dumb apart from throwing grenades to try to flush you out and things like that. Speaking of grenades, they altered the physics of the grenades so they no longer have the tiny path of patheticness that they did in the previous games. Instead, you can actually hurl those things pretty far. And needless to say, it's a pretty big improvement considering how horrible those things were to throw in the previous games. But the one addition they made that is most interesting to me, apart from the space battle that you get in the single-player campaign, which is just glorious, is that they added in armor abilities, which are a secondary power-up kind of thing, where when you pick them up, you can get special abilities like Armor Lock, where you just immediately stop moving and go into this kind of crouch stance and actually become invincible to fire while it's going on. Or you get active camouflage, or a jetpack, or the ability to sprint. Yes, it took them this long to figure out that a soldier on a battlefield might actually want to sprint. And even then, It's a very short time on the sprint, so it's actually kind of pointless, honestly. But suffice to say, it's just a general improvement in the mechanics. That said, it still has the same kind of problem that the previous games did, in that it's more fun when you're not running around on the ground and shooting stuff. It's more fun when you're in a vehicle, especially if you're in one of the flying vehicles or the starfighter, so to speak. You eventually get access to a space battle in the single-player campaign, and while it's nothing particularly amazing mechanically, it's just so refreshing compared to everything else you're doing. Unfortunately, it's only once in the entire game, but it's just incredibly refreshing to actually be able to go out into space and do some dogfighting. And they also throw in a segment where you're basically in a gunship and flying around, and that bit is also pretty cool, although you do have to get out of the gunship on occasion to complete an objective. But the stronger emphasis on the vehicles this time around, and the stronger gunplay and the better running around on the ground combat, just makes this an objective improvement over Halo 2, 3, and ODST. And yet a lot of Halo fans decried it, which begs the question of why they did. Well, there's a very simple answer for that. The multiplayer. They introduced loadouts, and people really didn't like that. That's actually kind of it, honestly. It's still the same Halo multiplayer, and they brought back firefight mode from Halo 3 ODST, but people complained about it because now there's loadouts instead of just being able to pick up whatever you want on the ground. Except that you can still do that, and it's really not that big of a deal. But people acted like it broke the game somehow, and it certainly didn't. People just went with the hyperbole on it, and thus you get the impression from the Halo community that Halo Reach's multiplayer is somehow an abomination of mankind or something like that. In reality, this is the best game in the series since Halo 1. It's the first game in the series that feels like it has actually evolved, rather than just incremented on a couple of things here and there and thrown things together from scraps they had in the original Halo. The plot is far more coherent and relatable than any of the previous Halo games. The gameplay itself is just a straight-up improvement over all of its predecessors. The addition of the space combat level is just incredibly refreshing in the sea of Halo-ness that you get, and the pacing of the game is just so much better, where it's interrupting your just running around on the ground killing things by throwing in these vehicle segments at just the right spot to keep it from getting too monotonous. And it feels like Bungie actually learned something with this one. And it really does help that this is the first game in the series to really establish some lore within the actual context of the games. Before this, most of the lore you just found in the books. And if you didn't read the books, you were just screwed. This time around, they actually kind of show you some things, and they talk about a few things here and there. Although, it's all within the context of the fall of Reach. And it works. So what do you have here? Halo Reach is actually a good game. Holy crap. The first good Halo game. At least since the original, which was just a fairly average FPS. But this one's actually pretty good. It's not amazing, it's not a masterpiece of the art form or anything like that, but it's still a very solid first-person shooter that if you're even not a Halo fan, you should be able to get something out of. I give it a 3.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.